My name is Hannah Reyes, and I used to believe that hard work always gets rewarded. I believed that if you gave a company everything, your nights, your weekends, your health, your loyalty, they would see your worth and treat you fairly. I was wrong. 2 years ago, I sat in a glass conference room on the 40th floor, wearing my best green blazer, watching 5 men in expensive suits decide whether I deserved a bonus for the work that saved their company from collapse. They said no. They said the budget was tight. They said maybe next year. They smiled while they said it, like it cost them nothing to lie to my face. What they did not know, what they had completely forgotten, was that I still owned the very code that was running their entire company. Every server, every system, every process that made their business function, day and night, was built on lines of code that legally, technically, and completely belonged to me. They thought they had all the power in that room. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Because 3 months later, during the biggest deal of their careers, a $645 million merger, I sent one simple email. 6 words. And when I hit send, I watched an empire built on my work start to shake. If you have ever been used by people who promised you the world and gave you nothing back, you are going to feel every second of the story. Because what happened next was not about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about something much bigger. The simple truth that respect is never optional, and the people who forget that always pay for it. Let me take you back to the beginning. Back to where it all started, in a small office with big dreams, long before the money, before the betrayal, and before I learned exactly what I was worth. 5 years earlier, I was 28 years old, sitting in a cramped co-working space with 3 other people who believed, just like I did, that we could build something that mattered. The company was called Veralytics. It was a data and automation platform, nothing fancy on paper, but underneath the surface, it was something special. It was built to help companies manage massive amounts of information without drowning in it. Think of it as the nervous system for a business, quietly running in the background, making sure everything worked the way it was supposed to. I was the lead engineer, not just an engineer, the architect, the one who designed the core system from nothing. Every important piece of that platform ran through code that I personally wrote, tested, and rebuilt more times than I can count. The founder, a man named Marcus Whitfield, was smart, charming, and endlessly persuasive. He had the kind of confidence that made investors want to write checks before he even finished his sentence. He was good at selling a vision. But visions do not run themselves. Someone has to build them, brick by brick, late at night, while everyone else is sleeping. That someone was me. In those early years, I did not mind the sacrifice. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that once the company grew, once we had real funding, once we became something, I would be rewarded for being there from day one. Marcus made promises. He said things like, "Hannah, when this takes off, you'll never have to worry about money again." He said, "You're not just an employee, you're a founder in spirit." He said a lot of things, and for a while, I believed every word. We grew. Slowly at first, then faster. We landed our first major client, then a second, then a third. Within 3 years, Veralytics went from 4 people in a cramped office to a company with over 200 employees and a valuation that made headlines in the business world. But here's the part that matters most. As the company grew, so did the complexity of the system I had built. And because I understood it better than anyone else, because I was the one who designed its foundation, I made a decision that would later change everything. I registered a piece of the core framework, the deepest layer of the system, the part that made everything else function, under a separate license. Not to hide it, not to steal from the company. I did it because early on, before there was a legal team, before there were contracts protecting either side, Marcus and I made a verbal agreement. He said the foundational framework would remain jointly owned, as insurance for both of us, until the company matured enough to formalize everything properly. I trusted that agreement. I trusted him. I never imagined it would become the very thing. As Veralytics grew larger, something started to shift. The warm, scrappy energy of the early days faded, replaced by boardrooms, quarterly targets, and investor pressure. Marcus changed too. Or maybe he did not change. Maybe he simply stopped needing to pretend anymore. New executives were hired. People with fancy titles and even fancier salaries, most of whom had never written a single line of code, never solved a single technical crisis at 2 in the morning, never stayed awake for 30 hours straight because a client's entire system crashed and only I knew how to fix it. They started making decisions about a product they barely understood, while I remained just the technical lead, a title that sounded senior but came with none of the respect that should follow it. I noticed small things at first. My input stopped being asked for in meetings. Ideas I raised were ignored, then mysteriously repeated by someone else a week later and praised as brilliant. My name slowly disappeared from internal documents, replaced by generic terms like the engineering team, even on projects I had built almost entirely alone. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself the work was what counted, not the credit. But then came the real test. A massive client, one of the biggest names in the logistics industry, was preparing to walk away from Veralytics after their system suffered a catastrophic failure right before a critical shipping cycle. Millions of dollars were on the line. The kind of disaster that could destroy a growing company's reputation overnight. Marcus called me at 11 at night, panic clear in his voice. "Hannah, I need you. Nobody else can fix this. Please." I did not hesitate. I worked through the night, then through the next day, then through another sleepless night. I found the failure buried deep inside a part of the system most people did not even understand existed. I rebuilt it, tested it, and delivered a fix before the client's deadline. We did not just save the account. We saved the entire company. That single client represented nearly 40% of Veralytics' revenue. If they had left, the company would have collapsed within months. Investors would have pulled out. Employees would have lost their jobs. I did that. Alone, in 18 hours, running on coffee and stubbornness. When it was over, Marcus hugged me in front of the whole office. He told everyone I was a hero. He said, in front of investors who had flown in for an emergency meeting, "This woman just saved this company. She deserves everything." I believed him. I should have known that words spoken in a moment of relief rarely survive the moment the crisis ends. 2 months later, it was bonus season. The company had just closed its best financial quarter in its history, largely because of that saved account. Everyone was talking about growth, about the next funding round, about how Veralytics was becoming one of the most promising companies in the industry. I walked into that boardroom expecting one thing: recognition. Not just praise, but something real. A bonus that reflected the fact that I had personally prevented the collapse of the entire business. Instead, I sat across from 5 executives, including Marcus, and listened to a man named Derek Chan, the newly appointed chief financial officer, explain in a calm, rehearsed voice why my bonus request was being denied. "Hannah, we appreciate everything you do," he said, "but bonuses this quarter are being reserved for leadership-level contributions. Your role, while important, falls under standard technical operations." Standard technical operations. I had rebuilt the system that generated their revenue. I had saved 40% of their income. I had not slept properly in months, keeping their platform alive. And I was being told my work was standard. I looked at Marcus, waiting for him to say something, to defend me, to remind them what I had done just weeks earlier when he called me a hero in front of everyone. He said nothing. He looked down at the table, avoided my eyes, and let the silence answer for him. That was the moment something inside me went cold. Not angry, not yet. Just cold, quiet, and very, very clear. I asked one simple question. "So the person who saved this company gets nothing, but the people who almost lost the account get their bonuses?" Derek smiled, the kind of smile people use when they think they have already won. "It's not personal, Hannah. It's just business. It's just business." I stood up, thanked them for their time, and walked out of that room without raising my voice, without slamming the door, without giving them a single second of satisfaction. But inside, I was already thinking about something they had all forgotten. Something buried in an old agreement signed years earlier, back when the company had nothing and I had everything they needed. They did not know it yet, but they had just made the most expensive mistake of their careers. 5. The discovery. That night, I went home and did something I had not done in years. I opened the old founding documents from Veralytics' earliest days. Most companies grow so fast that early agreements get buried, forgotten, replaced by newer contracts that overwrite the past. But some things, if worded carefully enough, survive. I found it. The clause Marcus and I had agreed on back when it was just the two of us and two other engineers in that tiny office. The clause stating that the core technical framework, the deepest, most essential part of the entire platform, would remain under joint intellectual ownership until a formal buyout agreement was signed. No formal buyout had ever happened, which meant, technically and legally, I still held partial ownership over the very foundation that Veralytics was built on. Not the company itself, not the brand, not the client contracts, but the code, the engine, the thing that made everything else run. I sat there in silence, staring at that document, feeling something shift inside me. This was not about petty revenge. This was not about proving a point out of anger. This was about protecting the truth. The truth that value should never be erased just because it becomes inconvenient for the people in charge to remember it. I made a decision that night. I would not sabotage anything. I would not destroy anything. I would not lie, cheat, or break a single rule. I would simply remind them who they were dealing with, using the very legal system they respected so much. I called a lawyer the next morning. Her name was Priya Anand, sharp, calm, and completely unshaken by the size of the company I was up against. She read the documents twice, looked up at me, and said something I will never forget. Hannah, if this clause is still valid, and it looks like it is, you don't just work at this company. In some very real sense, you still partially own the reason it exists. I did not smile. I did not celebrate. I simply nodded and said one sentence. Then it's time they remembered that. Over the next several weeks, I did something that surprised even myself. I did not quit. I did not create conflict. I showed up to work every single day, calm, professional, and quietly focused. Nobody suspected a thing. Behind the scenes, Priya and I built a careful, airtight case. We gathered every version of the original agreement. We tracked the digital history of the code repositories, proving beyond doubt that the foundational framework had never been formally transferred to full company ownership. We collected old emails between Marcus and me from the earliest days, where he clearly referred to the framework as our shared foundation. Every piece fit together like armor, built one plate at a time. Meanwhile, something big was happening inside Veralytics. Word began spreading that a much larger technology corporation was interested in acquiring the company. Not just investing, acquiring it completely, in a merger deal that could be worth over $600 million. The energy in the office became electric. Executives who once ignored me suddenly seemed busier, more stressed, more desperate to make sure every part of the company looked perfect for the incoming due diligence process. Due diligence. That is the process where the acquiring company examines every single detail of what they are buying, every contract, every asset, every piece of intellectual property, to make sure there are no hidden problems. I almost laughed when I heard that word being used so casually in meetings, because they were about to discover a hidden problem so significant, it could shake the entire deal to its core. Priya prepared a formal document, ready to be presented at exactly the right moment. Not to destroy the merger, not to punish innocent employees who had nothing to do with the decision to deny my bonus, but to force the people at the top to finally acknowledge the truth they had tried so hard to erase. I was not going to beg for recognition anymore. I was going to make it impossible for them to ignore. The day of the final merger meeting arrived. I was not supposed to be in that room. Technical leads like me were rarely invited to high-level financial discussions. But this time, due to a scheduling issue, I was asked to attend briefly to answer a technical question about system architecture for the acquiring company's engineers. I walked into that same glass conference room, the same room where they had denied my bonus months earlier, and sat quietly near the back while lawyers, executives, and investment bankers discussed numbers large enough to change lives. Marcus sat at the head of the table, more confident than I had ever seen him, clearly imagining the wealth this merger would bring him personally. I let them talk. I let them celebrate. I let them get comfortable. Then, When the lead negotiator from the acquiring company turned to ask a routine question about intellectual property confirmation, I quietly raised my hand. "Before we continue," I said calmly, "I think there's something important the legal teams should verify." The room went quiet. I looked directly at Marcus. "Who actually owns the core technology framework this entire platform is built on?" For a moment, nobody understood the weight of that question. Then Derek, the same CFO who told me it was just business, chuckled nervously. "Veralytics owns the technology, obviously," he said. I did not raise my voice. I did not smile. I simply placed a folder on the table and slid it toward the acquiring company's legal representative. "I'd recommend reviewing this before signing anything." The lawyer opened the folder. I watched her expression shift from confusion to concern to something closer to alarm as she scanned the documents Priya and I had prepared. She looked up. "This shows a joint ownership clause on the core framework that was never formally dissolved." The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever experienced in my life. Marcus's face went pale. Derek's jaw tightened. The other executives exchanged panicked glances, suddenly realizing that the deal they thought was finished was now standing on very uncertain ground. The CEO asked the question again, quieter this time, almost pleading. "Who actually owns the technology?" I answered clearly, without a single trace of anger in my voice. "I do. Partially. Legally. And I have never signed it away." Silence. Complete, total silence. What happened over the next few hours was chaos wrapped in expensive suits and forced calm. The acquiring company's legal team immediately paused the meeting. $645 million does not move forward when there is a question mark hanging over ownership of the very technology being purchased. Marcus pulled me aside in a private hallway, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Hannah, why would you do this now? Do you understand what you're risking?" I looked at him, calm and steady. "I'm not risking anything, Marcus. I'm protecting what's mine. You forgot that agreement." I didn't. "We can fix this quietly," he said. "Just sign something. We'll make it right." I almost laughed. "You had 2 years to make it right. You had one email to send when I asked for a bonus that I earned. Instead, you called it just business. So now, this is just business too." He did not have a response for that. Over the following days, Veralytics' legal team scrambled to verify the validity of the clause. To their horror and Priya's quiet satisfaction, everything held up. The agreement was real. It was binding. And it directly affected the ownership structure the acquiring company was paying for. The merger did not collapse. Deals of that size rarely die completely once both sides want them badly enough. But it changed dramatically. The acquiring company demanded a full resolution before moving forward. Veralytics had only one real option left: negotiate directly with me. For the first time in years, I was not the woman being dismissed in a boardroom. I was the person holding the leverage that determined whether the biggest deal of their careers would survive. Priya handled the formal negotiations with a calm precision that made me deeply grateful I had chosen her. But I made one thing clear from the very beginning. I was not trying to destroy Veralytics. I did not want to hurt the 200 employees who had nothing to do with the decisions made against me. I did not want to be remembered as someone who burned everything down out of anger. I wanted something much simpler. I wanted what I was always owed: recognition, fair compensation, and a guarantee that no one else would ever be treated the way I had been treated. The final agreement took 3 intense weeks to finalize. In the end, Veralytics agreed to a significant one-time compensation package tied directly to the value my technology contributed to the merger. Not a bonus this time, a legally binding, formally recognized ownership settlement. The number was substantial enough to change my life completely. But more than the money, what mattered most to me was something else entirely. They added my name, formally and permanently, into the intellectual property history of the platform I had built from nothing. Not as the engineering team. As Hannah Reyes, original architect. Marcus resigned from his position as CEO less than 4 months after the merger finalized. Investors, once they learned the full story, lost confidence in his leadership. Derek was quietly let go shortly after, his reputation deeply damaged in an industry where trust means everything. I did not celebrate their downfall. I did not need to. Their consequences were simply the natural result of the choices they made. I left Veralytics not long after, but not empty-handed and not silenced. I left with my dignity fully restored and enough resources to build something entirely my own. 6 months later, I started a new company. Small at first, just like Veralytics had been all those years ago. But this time, everything was different because I was different. I built a culture from day one where contribution is never invisible, where credit is given the moment it is earned, not months later after painful negotiations, where no one has to fight in court just to be acknowledged for saving a business. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how things unfolded at Veralytics. If I regret sending that email in the middle of the biggest meeting of their lives. I always give them the same answer. I do not regret protecting myself. I do not regret refusing to be erased. What I regret is trusting, for far too long, that hard work alone would be enough to earn respect from people who were never planning to give it freely. Here is what this story taught me, and what I hope it teaches you too. Loyalty without boundaries is not loyalty, it is vulnerability. The people who benefit most from your hard work are not always the people who will protect your worth. Sometimes, the very thing that keeps you safe is not your title, not your reputation, not even your relationships. It is the truth, documented carefully and remembered clearly, even when everyone around you seems to have conveniently forgotten it. If you have ever poured your heart into something, only to be dismissed the moment it became inconvenient to recognize you, I want you to remember Hannah's story. Not as a story about revenge, but as a story about self-respect. Because the moment you stop settling for less than you are worth is the moment everything begins to change. And sometimes, the quietest people in the room are holding more power than anyone realizes until the exact right moment they choose to use it. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, never let anyone convince you that what you built, what you earned, and what you are worth is something you should ever have to beg for.